Just a couple of housekeeping matters. Firstly, if you've got questions, please type them in the Q&A facility, and I will ask those of the presenter as we progress throughout the webinar itself. So yeah, just avoid using the chat facility if you don't mind, and type your questions in the Q&A there. Without further ado, it's my absolute pleasure to welcome Phil Johnson from Tanda, who's a sales manager with the organisation. And he's going to walk us through Tanda's software today, which is the world's #1 platform for rostering, attendance, labour insights and workforce success. So without further ado, over to you, please, Phil.
Awesome, and appreciate it, and thanks for having me along. I've made just a brief introduction slide, or a couple of slides, just to give people a bit of context on us as a vendor. And a lot of people might have come across our name, but have joined this demonstration to just specifically find out the points of like who might be suitable for Tanda and what we do that's a little bit different from other vendors, and of course the challenges that we solve for businesses. So I've deleted my usual sales slides and made it as informative as possible. And my hope is that you'll have a couple of questions at the end and we can get to the real juicy stuff that you might want to know. For a bit of context on us, we started in 2012 as a company, just solving the simple problem of employee attendance. And the thing we did differently was we ran an employee attendance device as a tablet. So just a standard consumer like iPad. And that made that technology accessible to small businesses. So people like an independent cafe who wouldn't purchase a fingerprint scanner for employee attendance could then go, okay, well, a tablet's reasonable, and then we're a purely subscription-based software. But from there, we've scaled out, and we've sort of broken away from other vendors in the sense that we occupy a large range of staff sizes, and particularly in the franchise space where they've got essentially that small business model but replicated, thousands of times. So we look after Domino's across Australia, New Zealand, and a lot of Europe, which is a few thousand stores. But then we have signups every day that are a minimum of say 5 employees would be the absolute minimum that would service, and that's where our minimum billing is set. In terms of the type of software that we are, I just made a quick slide after this as well to detail that. But where we show up on the app store, so this is a Xero app store, is under payroll and HR. There's a lot of different types of products there solving a lot of different things, but they broadly fit into these 3 categories, which is HR software, which you could think of as more of an administrative platform for managing staff things. So that would do things like generate employment contracts, and you'd record, say, records of conversation with employees in there. So it takes care of a lot of the employment admin. Then you've got the payroll software, which typically most of Australia, like Xero is the #1 payroll platform by number of businesses using it. For example, it's very obvious that most businesses in the small to medium space will use their accounting platform for that, but you can get obviously add-ons once you exceed the staff counts. But what that doesn't deal with is the award interpretation and coming up with what the pay actually should be. It'll just process the payroll. And the other thing is that while accounting platforms have some employee self-service, those functionalities are quite limited in their scope, so it doesn't deal with the actual shifts itself. So outside of those 2 categories of software is where Tanda sits. And there's some crossover, but the main distinctions are that we don't process payroll. So we integrate into payroll software. And we have the awards built into Tanda. So we calculate the gross pay, same for if it was an enterprise agreement as well. And the main challenges that we're dealing with are the actual employment processes that are to do with the shift itself. So the rostering and scheduling of staff members, managing of their leave processes, which gives light to the industries that we perform well in, which is anywhere that staff members get put onto a roster, would be fair enough to say. They're the industries that we service. So it's not confined to one vertical, but it's the type of employee it's the type of employee that you see on Tanda, and they're those people that would normally go onto a roster, and their work hours would change every week. The main functionality, I just rattled them off, and what it looks like for employees and employers. There's 3 different touch points that you'd have with Tanda. You can log in online. So any device, you can log in a web browser and you can bring up tanda.co. Employees and employers see different things. So the employee just sees their own schedule, their own shift details. The employer sees everything. So they can see their live information across the day. They can track this. Sales from point of sale, if they've got a cloud-based point of sale system in there, and compare that to their wage costs. Basically, it's your cockpit for running your shift. And then the other 2 are apps, and one's the attendance app, and I mentioned that's where we started off. So that's an employee walks in for their shift. The employee punches in a passcode. It takes a photo as verification. Optionally, you can turn on facial recognition as well, or not use a photo at all. But that becomes your attendance device. It's really cheap to deploy. You can use any modern consumer tablet. So, $100 Lenovo tablet does the job fine. Really cheap capital costs to get going. And then you've got the mobile app, which is same as Tanda.co. It's what employees and employers use, but they see different things. So the manager in their pocket, they got that app. It's telling them things about their shifts. It's telling them who's coming in, who should be there, who's late, who needs to go on break. Details about if they swap this person with that person, what would the cost difference be when you factor overtime. You can solve most of those things in the app. So they're the typical things that a manager would have to go back to their office to do. They can do live on the day. In terms of, I guess the big ticket thing this year has been, besides coronavirus, obviously, is the legislative changes around, annual salary reconciliations. It's put a lot of spotlight on the payroll process, and especially award interpretation, because a lot of businesses who haven't had to typically interpret modern awards now have to. So I thought I'd specifically address what we do differently there, just with a couple of slides. So we've got the templates of modern awards in there. It's not every award. It's about 30 of them, and they're the most common ones that we encounter in shift worker industries. You can customize them. So awards that have the ability to be customized for things like the span of ordinary hours, they're off the shelf in the system. You can go in and control those things. And then the major distinction between Tanda and other softwares is from those awards, we automatically build out the pay items of categories in Vibe and Xero. So if you get a new client going, you just enable the award. You click the integrate button, log into your Vibe Xero account to authorize access, and Tanda just pushes across the pay items that match up to our award rules. So it buys the extra automation that at the end of financial year just automatically updates. Same thing for birthdays and junior rates, those sorts of things. And how it compares to other vendors is, so in the setup phase, I mentioned that automatically creates the pay items. They're the things that are really tricky and can become quite annoying. But that one-to-one relationship between Tanda and payroll is the massive time saver there. And that compares to all other vendors tend to do it through like a sort of syntax method. Like it's just like if this equals that, and that has to be administrated manually. And also the application of allowances and loadings, they tend to be done manually in all other systems as well. So those things like an evening penalty under the hospitality award, or the evening allowance, I should say, those things are automated. So they just automatically apply to the timesheet, and that's what gets exported. Cool. Well, I'll flick over to a Tanda account, and I'll just go through the headline things you'd see there, and point out anything that's sort of different and unique about what we do. But before I open the account, I just wanted to address one thing that we do on the administrative side, which is employee onboarding. So that's for a new employee who you're hiring, it just covers off all of their sort of statutory paperwork that that every employee has, like a super choice form, bank details. The employee fills this out from home, so they can do it on their phone, they can do it on a computer. Automatically lodges the tax file declaration to the ATO if you're with a payroll product that doesn't do that. So it'll check that the TFN is real. It has some smarts in here, so things that people usually get wrong, like tax-free threshold. If you said no, it's going to ask, is this you and the employer? If you said yes, it'll give you more details. So they're smart forms, so they're a bit simpler, and they have some logic built in that catches out the things that people usually get wrong. Integrates that automatically into Tanda, so that employees created in Tanda and they're created in payroll. For your existing staff, when you start with Tanda, they just import across directly from your payroll software. So if you just hired that employee, you've just collected their details, they're now in Tanda, you just apply the award to them. So I've applied an award template in the Tanda account. That employee would show up on the staff list. They'll be highlighted as a new employee, and you just go and classify them under the level of that award, which then explains how we get the costings in the app and the costings on the roster. Is basically just can go, the general retail industry award, employment type, and level. And the typical questions we get there around like how can you customize that, and can it be changed? So for an enterprise agreement, you can completely build your own set of rules. You don't have to use our template at all. There's those off-the-shelf customizations, and then there's a little bit more detail in there as well. So you can have a default level 1 employee who can work higher duties, and then relate those higher duties to the teams that the employee works in. So if they're rostered on to work as a manager, it automatically applies level 2. If they're rostered on as an employee, automatically apply level 1. And then you can customize further in terms of the specifics around the individual flexibility agreements. So you can pay them above award and those sorts of things that can all be done off the shelf. But basically, that employee now has a set of rules attributed to them, which has happened automatically. You wouldn't usually look at this page, but if you ever wanted to see like what the full set of rules is, it's all public and visible there. And basically that just means if that employee clocks in and clocks out now, you've automatically calculated any allowances, penalties, overtime, public holiday rates, anything that applies to that employee on their timesheet. So from the start time and finish time, Tanda's then applied what conditions would be applicable there, broken it down, and that integrates into your payroll. Cool. So I hope that gives some good context in terms of like what's different about our award interpretation versus other systems. I'll just show a couple of functionalities that deal with the actual like management of staff and the processes you would follow within Tanda. So now that employee is classified, when you get to the rostering stage, everything in there is costed. So you've got all that background context that you need to build a compliant roster. So you've got the industrial conditions there to show that you're giving the adequate time off between shifts. You're managing their leave considerations and anything else there. So like 2 short shifts, 2 long shifts, not enough time between, or in industries where you require consecutive days off in a rostering period, those sorts of logic can be built in. And some of them are in there by default as well. So the things that pertain to the award. And what it's going to do is if you were to breach any of those conditions, it'll throw up a little red flag as you're building out your roster. So looking at 1 week here, looking at 1 team of retail assistants, and you can see a little red flag here, which will explain if there's some sort of error to do with that shift. So as you're building out a schedule, all those sorts of things you normally have on sticky notes or a compilation of things in emails from employees are all built into the background. So you can just go in and say, oh, okay, I want to swap that shift. Who would be available? It'll color code based on the employee's availabilities, their skills and capabilities, and their costs. Who could fill that shift and who would be a suitable replacement for that employee. The other thing that you'll get there is you'll notice up here we've got some schedule stats. You can customize what you want those to be, but basically you look at things like your gross costs there. You can then look at those costs based on an employee basis and get things like your average hourly rate and look at what the total gross cost for that employee would be. But basically it just speeds up the process of building a schedule and gives managers, I guess, the context that they would need, even if they'd never worked in that business, to understand how to build a compliant schedule that has the right people in the right place at the right time. And that's one of the hardest things. So if you're a new manager, typically rostering is the last thing you learn because you learn about all the operations first, but all that information is contained in here. Typically you wouldn't build from scratch. You'd build off something like a roster pattern, or you'd be copying your previous schedule forwards. So roster patterns, for example, would be someone who has a predictable work schedule. So you can actually go and schedule that in. That might be their their regular hours of work if it's a permanent employee, for example. And then you can just automatically populate that out as far as you want into the future. So from there, you'd publish that out. Employee's going to get that schedule on their app. So your app will buzz in your pocket, says you've got a new shift. So it could be for any period you want to publish as an employer. You can select how long you want to do out into the future, or you can publish individual shifts. Really up to you in terms of the cadence you want to do that. And that gets employees to the stage then of turning up to their shift and clocking in. When an employee comes and registers their attendance on site, let's say you're a fixed location business, that employee clocks in, it registers what device they use to clock in, and that clock in comes straight to the dashboard. So that live relationship between the clock in and the timesheet means that you can enable a whole heap of functionality around managing the day of operations, because you know as soon as they clock in, it's going to transfer that photograph and the data to tender.co. The manager's app in their pocket can highlight any differences. So over on the right here, you've got the live wage tracker. It's just got a red line here showing your staff count versus your roster. So who's actually on shift versus what you expected to be on shift. Those variances, every time there's a variance there, the manager's aware of it because it's buzzed in their pocket, and they can manage things proactively. So it's not a case of closing off the pay period and then figuring out that you spent more than you expected in wages. You know that that's happening as the shift is going on. You can see exactly what you need to do to save money as well. You can view that in a cost basis as well. And that's quite unique, as the award interpretation applying live. Typically with all other systems, you close your shift and then that's when the system will perform the calculation. Tender's constantly calculating the pay. So you can actually see what you've consumed in cost at any point in time throughout the day. And you can also go one step further, and that's with your cloud-based point of sales, and bring in data over the top of that for sales. So you can look at your comparison of your sales versus your labor cost as well. Cool. So those clock-ins have just populated timesheets, and that's the last stage before exporting to payroll. Is managers would go through and approve timesheets. The main considerations here are just in terms of the authority to approve and who would approve things. You set up a structure in here based on teams. So if you had a broken down set of teams and certain managers are accountable to certain employees, they would just approve those timesheets. You can have auto approvals on. So if the roster matches exactly the actual clock-ins, it'll automatically approve the shift. And you can customize your roundings as well. So if you wanted to apply rounding before the shift, so employee can clock in, but you know they don't actually start to a certain time, you can apply that. And the basic process would be a manager would go through, approve at the end of the day their shift, and at the end of the pay period, you're going to have weekly, fortnightly, monthly timesheets ready for export, so you can track the progress of managers in terms of how far they've gone through. So if you've got a client who's approving their timesheets on site, you can go through and see what the status of those are, so you can figure out whether they've been approved, who's need approval. And in the next stage, if you're actually exporting those timesheets, it's going to proactively flag any data that's missing, so you can see exactly what needs to be done. So you can see there's a whole heap here that haven't been approved, or they haven't had they've got times missing in them. So it means that you're only exporting clean data to payroll. And this screen here would be a final check and balance as well. So if you wanted to see exactly how pay was calculated for these employees, you can see the breakdown of the gross pay. And it shows you exactly what information would be sent across to your payroll system. So number of hours that match up to a certain category in payroll. Cool. That will factor in leave as well. So if you've got a leave approval in one of those pay periods, let's say it's annual leave, 7.6 hours, that'll be factored into that timesheet export. So it'll reduce the accrued balance of leave in your payroll software. But the actual leave management you can do within Tender. So managers can approve leave requests in Tender, employees can submit them. And that basically, after that point of exporting those timesheets, you can start generating reports on that. So you've got a lot more contextual data in Tender on what were the actual drivers of wage cost, rather than payroll and accounting software, which tends to deal with what is the total wage cost. Tender deals with the challenge of what made the wage cost where it was, and what are the things you could do to control that. So they're not all financial reports. Some of them are things like the attendance report, which give you that objective information of how punctual are staff members, who are the people who are overstaying their rosters continually, and and consuming more wage costs than usual. And it's really good for giving employee feedback as well. So a manager can sit down with an employee and have that conversation about their punctuality. And you know that there's the transparency there of having the original records of the clock-ins as well. So I know that's a super quick 20-minute run through, but I was hoping we could open up to questions. There's a lot more in the system that I didn't go through, but confident that if we ask some questions, that could lead to some further discovery.
Thanks, Phil. So there's no questions in the Q&A facility at this stage. I just put it out there to attendees. Is there anything else that you would like Phil to demonstrate for us within the software? I have to say, Phil, it's pretty impressive.
Cool. I just went through what I consider to be the main points. Yeah, thanks for the feedback. I'm confident that someone in there has a juicy question they want to ask. So, but if not, I can just run through sort of the setup process of what would be involved in getting a client live, if you think that'd be appropriate. But I'd far prefer if someone had a question, because everyone's probably thinking similar things.
Well, no questions at this stage, so perhaps the setup would be really beneficial. Thanks, Phil.
Yeah, so the actual process of getting a client live starts with a trial account. So every account that you set up in Tanda starts as a 14-day trial. We give bookkeepers and accountants the authority to create their own client accounts. So if you sign up online with start a free trial here, we call every lead, but if you want to reach out proactively, I'll put my details up at the end. I'll just set you up with one of those partner accounts. So you've got the authority to create your client accounts. Then it's a 14-day trial, so you can actually show the client, and they can use it as well, and validate that it sort of meets their requirements. In that process, it's actually a full Tanda account. So you can go in and you can import their employees, and typically that's like that really is what you need to do to get to the stage of building a roster. Is you'd add your staff, you'd import from your relative system. If it's an old school non-cloud based system, you can, as long as you can get employee data into a spreadsheet, you can get it into Tanda. It'll take across any format, as long as it's got the things like, you know, the name, the email of the employee at very least. That'll create your staff list, and then you're really just building out and customizing things like your team setup. So it'll be a matter of working with the client, looking at their schedule, and figuring out how you'd replicate the same sort of setup as how they operate now. So the same sort of roles and departments and management structure in there. And then is a matter of customizing a little bit further in terms of what operational considerations they'd have. So it's things like I mentioned on timesheets, how breaks would operate, or what notifications they'd want to go to a manager, which really you can fine tune those things over time, because none of them are sort of set and forget settings. You can always come back and do them. Basically, if you ran through an order of our settings, that would explain to you exactly what can be customized. So things like who should see costs out of your management team, what functionality you want employees to access. For example, do you want employees to see their own gross pay? And then just things like, you know, how much time you would need to give through an unavailability request, all those sorts of operational considerations. If you did those three things, you'd be at the stage of going to a roster, and you'd have a blank roster sitting there ready to build, of which you could either build out a template or build your first schedule and save it as a template, which is that's the most common way that people go about that. So first time round, building out a schedule will take a little bit longer, but once you've done your first one, the process from there is a lot quicker.
Phil, we've had a question around, can multi-site attendance be handled? For example, service technicians travelling to several jobs each shift.
Yeah, that's a fair question, and there's probably two main questions we get around that. One's about remote workforces and geofencing. So you'll notice that we've got the Google addresses in there, and that's how you run geofencing, of which you can set the parameters in terms of how many meters outside of that area you would want. But the setup here is showing locations, and under that is got teams. So you can just, if you've got the same team set up for every location, you can just duplicate those out. It'd be most practical for businesses who regularly visit the same locations. So if you were a tradesperson, for example, who typically services domestic and you do a different job every day, you're probably more suited to a trade-specific software that deals with that nature of like booking in clients, and that creates the job. We would do better in industries that, say, commercial contractors like cleaners who visit the same locations. And that could be hundreds of locations, but the nature of recreating them is such that you would typically build out your set of locations, and you wouldn't want to be manually intervening with them every pay period and doing, say, 100 new ones. Typically there'll be people that visit fixed locations. And so the other one that we get commonly there is in relation to a feature we call multi-payroll, which is if you've got multiple businesses and you want to connect up multiple accounting files, how we handle that. And there's an intrinsic relationship between the integration. So you can connect up as many accounting files as you want. There's no limit. So you just keep going new payroll integration and adding them in there. And the relationship between that integration and the employee is via the location. So you go, that integration applies to one of these locations. And then on the employee profile, those employees have a default payroll team, which belongs under one of those locations. So it basically means that if you have an employee who works in multiple businesses, you can then determine which ones go to which zero file, for example. And that solves a challenge, especially for, say, a multi-site franchisee who might have staff who regularly work across other locations, but they're all different proprietary entities. Hope that answers that question.
And we've got another one around the calculation of time off in lieu.
Yeah, so the way we handle that, and it depends on the condition that triggers it, but most commonly it's just a replacement of the overtime rule under the template. So I'll show you what a raw, like an actual rule looks like in terms of the user interface if you were configuring one of these pay rules. So that let's say that's your time in lieu for daily overtime. That'll be defined as an overtime hour after a certain number of hours, which let's say is just 8 hours in a day. And at the end part here, where you're going to say what pay rate it's going to be paid as, you're going to export it as a time and lieu accrual. And it's basically just going to take those hours, and rather than calculate a pay rate, it's going to export it as a leave type. So you can actually accrue in your payroll software an amount of leave attributable. You can actually accrue it in Tanda as well. So it's up to you in terms of whether you want to have it in your accounting software or in Tanda. The reason we see most people do it in their accounting software is so that they can put it on the pay slip and employees can see their balance. With that said, they can see their balance in Tanda as well. So up to you as to whether you want to accrue it in Tanda or payroll, but you can basically treat that like a leave type. And if an employer wanted to consume their balance, they would put in a time off application exactly the same way as they would a leave request, but they'll see a leave type called time in lieu. And you can customize the naming conventions there. So if that's not the exact naming you use, you can call it anything you want.
And there was also interest in the pricing structure there, Phil.
Yeah, that's a super easy one. We sell one product, you get the whole thing. The major distinctions are, like, we have an enterprise product. It's the same thing, but we give people a sort of a unique instance of Tanda, and they can do a little bit more customization. But essentially, what people see is exactly the same thing. And the only other thing that we do separately is the employee onboarding. So it's the method of hiring staff members. So I'll just go through what the two different pricings would be. Employee onboarding is $5 every time you onboard an employee, if you want it as a standalone feature. So if all you liked out of this demonstration was this, you can have that for $5 per onboard. It's just once off. So if you don't onboard anyone in the month, you don't pay anything. And when it comes to Tanda itself, which is everything that we just went through, including onboarding. You get the whole lot. So it's not like you pay for bits and pieces, like you pay for rostering and then have to pay for something else. You get the whole lot, and it's $10 or $8 per employee per month, depending on whether you pay monthly or annually on a contract. So month to month, we're just discussing before people joined the demonstration. That's like like coronavirus is just such a good example of the benefits of a month-to-month software subscription, because if you didn't want to continue, you just simply didn't pay the next month, or you reduce your staff count to a skeleton crew, and it's a variable cost with that as well. The annual plan suits businesses that don't have a seasonal nature. So if you're a business where you have a pretty stable staff count throughout the year, so like that's like registered clubs and medical practices and those sorts of businesses that they know where their staff count is going to be, and they don't have a cyclical nature, they get a 20% discount for paying annually.
So Phil, there's a statutory amount of time that we are required to retain payroll information. How, if someone ceased being an employer, how long would Tanda retain their information?
Yeah, so our T's and C's have 7 years put in there. It's an interesting question because we're just coming up on that now in terms of like the time that we've been a vendor. For reference, it's hosted in Amazon Web Servers, so it's in Sydney in Australia. But yeah, seven years is what we've put in writing. But the question as to whether we'd retain it further than that, I would have to look into that. I'm pretty confident our plan is to continue to retain the data. But if you cease to be a customer, you can still actually log in. So if you're the admin who had the billing details in there, you can log back into your account. You can access your historical records. So if you ever needed to produce them, you can do that. And if you wanted to bulk export them, if you cease to be a customer, you can also request your export on bulk, or you can export it yourself out of your account. So that's an export that it breaks down the award interpretation, how the calculations took place, but also gives the raw attendance status, the actual clock ins and clock outs.
That's fantastic. Thanks, Phil. No further questions at this point.
Awesome. On that note as well, so you can read further detail on that. Our privacy policy and T's and C's are public. They're both on our website, as is the ability to open the trial account. So my recommendation, if there's something you liked in here, I'll put up a slide with my contact details next. But you can just go in and open a free trial yourself if you want to play around with it. What you'll go into is a full Tanda account. So it's like the trial account's not a locked down thing where you only see half of it. It's the full Tanda account. You can access everything in there that we just went through. You can test it out. You can connect up to payroll. You can do a test export. And if you had any other further questions or you wanted to arrange a demonstration for your client, just shoot us a message personally, and I'll arrange that with one of our team members. So our sales team are arranged into industries. So I'll try and find the best person who'd suit your client.
Fantastic, Phil. Well, thank you so much for that. It's very impressive software and extremely reasonably priced as well. I'll just give it a moment to see if there are any other questions to come through. No, it doesn't look as though there is. So just partners@tanda.co for anything else that crops up, any other requests. On behalf of AAT, Phil, I'd really like to thank you for your time today. Sorry, I've just got a question coming through here from Simone. Happy to answer any questions about someone who has actually used Tanda NMYB and set up for the hospitality industry. Would you be happy to speak to a specific circumstance, Phil?
So to give an example of a client who has set up for their specific operation.
I think she's asking if you would be happy to answer a question about someone who is using Tanda and NMYB.
Oh, from an existing client. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Did you want to?
Well, I could give a couple of options. I can stay on the call or pass on my number if they'd like to discuss further.
Yeah.
Unless
Simone's got some advice to offer.
Oh, cool.
I might connect with you offline, Simone, if that's okay.
Yeah, let's do that. If you want to pass on my details to Simone, then we can connect that way.
Yep, she says that she knows you, so we'll take this offline. Okay.
Awesome. Well, I really appreciate the invitation, and thanks everyone for joining.
Thank you, Phil. Have a wonderful afternoon, everyone.